I remember a moment in time when I think I came and saw you at university. Is that right, Charlie?
Quite possibly. Quite
Yeah,
possibly.
it was up in Cambridge, and it was the first time that I'd ever gone to somewhere as posh and scholarly as coming up to meet you up at Cambridge University. And I remember speaking at that time with you and just feeling very honoured to be in the same space and be talking about theology, to be thinking about Judaism, and to be thinking about also the rabbinate as a profession as well. It's been incredible to grow up in and around your life and your family, and also just to see how you have experienced life through Cambridge and working through theology and then at King's College, but also spending time in Israel, some wonderful scholarly occasions, and also some very formative experiences like at Mike's Bar in Tel Aviv. Very, very important as well in everybody's life. Charley, I'm sure you're aware, was ordained at Leo Beck College, rabbinical school in the UK, and has been a rabbi at Kingston Liberal Synagogue for over 10 years. Was also a rabbi at South Bucks Jewish Community for 4 years, and latterly has been the leader of our movement, the chief executive of Liberal Judaism, providing a voice which is heard loud and wide across not only the UK now, but overseas as well, leading us and keeping us in order. And this evening, especially on a poignant night as well, on Kristallnacht, the anniversary of Kristallnacht, it couldn't have been more appropriate. That theme tonight is the issues of post-Holocaust theology on liberal Jewish values. Charley.
Thank you, Aaron. Wow, what an introduction. There's an awful lot following that introduction that's going through my head, actually. I think first, I just want to acknowledge that it is Kristallnacht. My parents are in Israel at the moment, and my dad, who is the Board of Deputies representative for AJR, for the Association of Jewish Refugees, which more recently I've found myself getting involved in with the real recognition of being kind of third generation. My dad posted tonight that Kristallnacht, that it was the night that the Hotel Baginsky in Lesno closed its doors for the last night after and I can see Miriam nodding in our shared family history with the Baginsky name somewhere in there, but that in Lesno that the windows were smashed out of the hotel, and it was the last night that it opened. And really tonight feels very significant that actually I'm teaching that what we're learning about together, and I do mean together, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, is post-Holocaust theology. One of the strange things about being a rabbi, particularly I think a rabbi who graduates from Leo Beck, is that you spend an awful lot of your studentdom, which now particularly for those rabbis of us that are in the room, was quite a while ago, immersed in quite intense academic studies, and then you go into congregation and you realize that although you may be teaching some of the things you learnt at Leo Beck, that actually your own study gets sometimes a little bit neglected. And it was first time I studied anything about post-Holocaust theology was at King's College, where I studied with the teacher there was Dr. Daniel Reinhold. And he was really committed to teaching at King's Jewish philosophy, only nobody else wanted to do Jewish philosophy as part of the theology course except for me. And I was really lucky that he carried on teaching the course. He's now in Israel, and I'm sure he has lots of people studying philosophy with him. But at the time, it was just me. And every time we would have a session on Jewish philosophy, and this maybe shows my naivety, I'd be like, this is amazing, and this must be the answer. And then we'd study something the following week, and I would be like, oh, no, this is the answer. But he introduced me to Yosef Soloveitchik, and it really did, and particularly in post-Holocaust theology, and I think was really significant for opening my eyes to wanting to do more Jewish study and be immersed in it. And I would say really was a turning point for me, from going for somebody who'd ended up back in the UK. Aaron indicated I was in Israel for a while, who came back from Israel really on a kind of temporary basis to finish my degree. And this, studying post-Holocaust theology, connecting something that was both a deep kind of sense of struggling with my own spirituality and what did it mean to be in the UK, having been in Israel where religion took a kind of back seat because it was so much part of my daily life, to now studying Jewish philosophy in quite an intense way. And this moment became very significant. So when I started looking at tonight's session, I thought, dead easy. I've taught post-Holocaust theology several times. One fairly recently, I saw Suzanne was in the room on a LJ course when we were still at the Montague Centre, no problem. And then I saw that sneaky Aaron, in his way, had stuck in this additional line which said, with its impact on liberal Judaism, on liberal Jewish values. And I realised that I had to kind of go back and do some rethinking about really of this in its context. And what I realized in this very kind of long introduction to my starting is that how outdated my own kind of study was, that or maybe more that the maturity of being in the rabbinate, of being in community, means that the questions that you're asking about some of this academic things that you pick up during your studies suddenly need to be rethought of in the context of community. And so as much as I swore at Aaron in my head for a few minutes, actually I feel really like we're going to go on a bit of a journey together with this, and what I really hope is that you won't let me carry on just talking, that you'll interrupt, ask questions, poke holes in to help me think through this, because it really is something that I'm doing some thinking about as well. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's have a go. Oh, you have to let me. It's not letting me, Tom. So maybe you can share it from yours, do you think? Yeah, great. So the first starting point of where I want to take us is kind of not thinking specifically about the Holocaust, but thinking about this end bit about impacting on Jewish identity. We all know, I think probably by now, that Jews tend not to agree with each other as to what constitute one's identity. Is it religious? Is it ethnic? Is it ethno-religious? And what are those proportions? Indeed, with a World Cup and however we feel about that, that might influence some of our liberal Jewish values. But with a World Cup approaching, it often causes that question: are you, if Israel were playing against England, who would you support? Are you a Jewish Brit, a British Jew, or something else? And most of this difference of opinion within the Jewish community is because there isn't really one common interpretation of self, whether that's the self as a liberal Jew or that self as a Jew in a wider context. It's very difficult to come up with a common interpretation. We often talk about Judaisms as opposed to the Judaism. And into this mix, we get this construction of identity in the UK specifically, which has kind of brought together two quite conflicting ideas, I think, particularly as liberal Jews, of on one hand, of wanting to be part of mainstream culture. If I even go back to my grandmother and my grandfather, of wanting to be more British than the Brits, of not speaking German to their children because they didn't want them to go out speaking with a German accent. And yet at the same time, this kind of quite traditional sense of Jewish values and practices, and of trying to find a way to combine these two together. And so there's the question of what brings us together, whether that's rituals or sociological events or political moments, or perhaps in this context, the Holocaust. For some people, the Holocaust has been a call to return to traditional, whatever that means necessarily, religious observance. And for others, it's the call to integrate into the non-Jewish world to avoid such things happening again. And for others still, it's a combination on insisting on particularity and extending a hand to outside to the general concern of humanity, to oppose mass murder and genocide. And then on the other hand, it's also, when we think about liberal Judaism, the number of people that have come into liberal Judaism, how does one inherit a history? How does one make sense of something that maybe did not happen to somebody's own family, and yet to feel that it's part of your history? For some, that relationship is very conscious, and for others, it's so much part of them that you can't necessarily distinguish from it. In 2013, the Pew Research of Jews in the United States said a striking 73% of respondents said remembering the Holocaust was essential to being Jewish. This was the highest ranked response to the question of what made them feel Jewish, outstripping values such as leading an ethical and moral life, observing Jewish law, or even caring about Israel. Activities such as the March of Living were founded 30 years ago as an annual pilgrimage, starting at the Nazi killing centers in Poland and then culminating in this triumphant arrival in Israel. And according to its own website, the program uses the backdrop of the Holocaust to strengthen Jewish identity, to strengthen connections to Israel, and to build a community of future Jewish leaders. We know ourselves within our own communities that our Czech scrolls have become so much part of the history of many of our communities. Many communities will partner with a child killed during the Holocaust as part of the Bar Mitzvah program. So you get at this significant Jewish milestone based on Jewish learning and celebrating. We have into it this kind of centrality of somebody else who couldn't be there, of a murdered young person. And so we're constantly in our identities combining this trauma, which we ourselves, many of us will say, is of unprecedented proportions, becoming this preeminent thing that can define us, or if not define us, at least is often used as a way of uniting us as Jews. For many Jews, and I mentioned my dad before, it's in the organizations that we support. It's the kind of the emphasis to keep our own religion going, a responsibility, a way to keep history alive, and, you know, to spur on the next generations. My son was bar mitzvahed in April, and that sense of being a next generation, that my grandmother had come to this country, my grandfather had come to this country, that they were, you know, that they had these new generations being able to celebrate these moments was very present in our lives. Similarly, the literary scholar, and this is the quote that you have on the screens, called the American Jewish focus on the Holocaust the epidemic excess of necessity. He was writing in 1981, and he was trying to reject the centrality of the Holocaust in American Judaism. But I think while Europe's story is different, in this case, it does actually perhaps resonate. He said that maybe more than anything else, an appeal to Jewish masochism, an attempt to base collective identity on a sense of dread, or if we're utterly honest about these matters, on the special frisson of vicariously experiencing the unspeakable in the material comfort and security of our American lives. If we replace American with British, or there's anybody here from other parts of the world, replace it, whether it still speaks true, I think that for some of us, there is a definite resonance. If we take the rise of anti-Semitism on campus, there is something, and I'm not saying that necessarily is true within our liberal communities, but looking at some of the narratives around the rising anti-Semitism on university campuses, one can see that it's also used as a way of galvanizing young people into Jewish groupings. And again, here, I think we see this possible paradox of being liberal Jews, of on one hand, wanting to be very much a confident identity as a liberal Jew, as a Jew, while I was on the other hand, wanting to be very much part of society. And where that identity of the impact of the Holocaust has on our own identities impacts, therefore, on the sense of our theology. We are constantly asking ourselves, why do bad things happen to good people? If God is so powerful, why doesn't God prevent misfortune? This question of suffering and evil is unique amongst all theological and philosophical problems because it confronts us almost daily. You know, even from a small child, when we say, God, don't let this happen, or else I won't do this, or I promise not to eat those sweets if you don't let mummy find out that I've done this. It's based there right in our earliest theology. And Jewish thinkers have always been bothered by the existence of suffering and evil. But in modern times, because of the result of the Holocaust, it's taken on a central role in almost all contemporary theologians, except in some notable exceptions, which I'll come on to, at least maybe not very, very modern, but the kind of postmodern theologians. And yet, while we've taught post-Holocaust theology a lot, and this is the point, we haven't necessarily realized how much we've ignored the female voices. And also, as I'm beginning to realize through my own kind of, even in the last few days study, those voices of queer theology. So genocide's often referred to as the ultimate crime or the crime of crimes. Yet from its conception, it's referred to destroying one particular group. So what happens, therefore, when those groups cross over, where there's a crossover in identity? This discursive formation of genocide may be broadly conceptualized in a manner of Foucault's between objects, between types of statement or concepts. One could define it as a regularity. And in such cases, it needs a central signifier. And so when you have these competing identities within the discourse of the Holocaust, other identities seem to get lost. And so I was, it's ironic to have, or ironic or wonderful or slightly intimidating to have Rabbi Dr. Judith Rosenberry in the room, but I was just today reading her article in Reformed Judaism in the Journal, which was from 2008, which seems to have so much foresight really on kind of a lot of the dialogue which is happening today. So I'm going to recommend that you go and read it, because I'm never going to do justice to it. And I'm going to come on to summarizing a little bit of the problems in terms of post-Holocaust theology. It's called Revealing Hidden Aspects of Divinity in the Queer Face Towards a Jewish Queer Liberation Theology. And I'm sure we can circulate that with the notes. But basically, when we look at the problem of theodicy, when the problem of why do bad things happen to good people, for Jews the problem is twofold. There's the universal problem and the particular problem. The universal problem is a philosophical one. It's not just a problem for Jews, but for anybody who conceives of God in a certain way. If God knows everything, then God knows about all evil. If God is all powerful, then God can prevent all evil. If God is perfectly good, then God should prevent all evil. And yet, as we all know, evil still exists. So how can this be true? Historically, Jewish thinkers didn't articulate the problem of evil in this way until the Middle Ages. Earlier Jewish literature conceives of God as powerful, good, and knowledgeable, but not perfectly so. It was the particular problem of suffering and evil, a problem resulting from that unique relationship. And here again, we get this issue of the unique, special relationship, the particularism with the universal. So this unique relationship between God and the Jews, we were the special people. So therefore, how come evil continues to, or bad things keep happening to us? According to the Torah, the covenant at Sinai, when the Israelites agreed to abide by the commandments, established that Jews would be rewarded if they followed God's ways. And yet suffering often seems to be meted out randomly. Righteous people suffer and wicked people prosper. And how can this be reconciled with that special relationship between God and the Jews? So we could spend hours talking about the specific problems of theodicy, but you're here to hear particularly about the Holocaust. And actually, many post-Holocaust theologians didn't, or most theologians following the Holocaust didn't actually deal with it until many years later. Perhaps the trauma of what had happened to the Jewish world meant that many people were unable to even begin to try and work out how to reconcile these previous existence of theodicy solutions. The Job, you do not try and understand it, reward and punishment. If we do good, we get rewarded. If we do bad, we're punished. Or suffering actually is beneficial, that actually we grow and develop from our suffering. They weren't comprehensive enough answers. We did get a few people try and tackle it. Notably, I think, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe, the leader of the Hasidic community in Hungary, basically said the Holocaust was a divine punishment for the secular Zionist efforts to create a modern Jewish state of Israel, which I'm sure all of us find really hard to even contemplate. The Reform Rabbi Ignaz Maybaum also argued that instead that the deaths of the Jewish victims of Nazism should be interpreted through the lens of a cruciform hermeneutic, that the murdered Jews are reflective of a new crucifixion through which God raises humanity to a greater level of maturity. That's kind of the suffering is beneficial, reinterpreted, and leads the world into a new era of progress. For Maybaum, the Shoah is yet another event in Israeli history that mediates atonement, like the destruction of the first and second temples. Auschwitz is the Chuban, the destruction, but not for its own sake, but for the sake of some sort of socio-cultural evolution, first of the Jews and through the Jews of all humanity. But they were very... they were on their own, really, in terms of early theological explanations, or maybe explanations is an inadequate word for the theology post-Holocaust, but rather they were early interpretations of trying to come to grips with theodicy. So it wasn't until much later that we begin to find theologians wrestling with specifically with the Shoah. And the main issues when you look across these theologians is the uniqueness of the Shoah. Was the Shoah a unique event in history, or was, more like Maybaum, it to be seen in relationship to other destructions of the past? The second question, coming back to that kind of ultimate question of theodicy, where was God? And the third, and perhaps the one that really I think is most reflective of this kind of postmodern dialogue, is how do we respond? And really, for me, that was where I found Soloveitchik, in his sense that it was not about trying to explain the Holocaust, but rather to look at how we as humanity respond. And I'm really conscious of time and wanting us to be able to wrestle a little bit with some of the text and to hear your voices. So I'm going to run a little bit very, very quickly through three thinkers, Soloveitchik, Fackenheim and Greenberg, just to give us a little bit of a sense of what are some of the main thoughts. So Soloveitchik, 1903 to 1993, known as the Rav, American Orthodox rabbi, Talmudist, philosopher, very influential, still really taught as part of the school of Jewish philosophy, not just within the Jewish and Orthodox world. For Soloveitchik, this shared fate and common historical fate of the Jewish people represented what he called the Brit Goral, a covenant of destiny, which is the foundation of the important halakhic category of collective responsibility. So your care for others, solidarity, etc. And you cannot, he says, understand the Shoah philosophically. Rather, one has to think about how one responds. That said, the Shoah follows part of his overall philosophy on evil, that basically God was hiding God's face. And he rejects classic theodicy as seeing God, the suffering as not being something we can understand, but rather we have to be called to respond creatively and productively, and ask ourselves, what obligation does suffering impose? He only really talks, the problematic with Soloveitchik is that he only really talks about humanity's reaction and doesn't really deal with God's character, or what does it tell us about God. Fackenheim, 1916 to 2003, was Jewish philosopher, also a Reform rabbi, born in Germany, arrested by the Nazis significantly for tonight on Kristallnacht and held in a concentration camp. He then escaped to England, where he was joined by his parents, but both his brothers, like my own grandfather's brothers, were killed. He was interned in Canada in 1940 and studied there. Fackenheim's approach was very much a pragmatic approach. The Shoah must be understood as an imperative, requiring Jews to carry on Jewish existence and the survival of the state of Israel, where he himself emigrated to in 1984. He makes this separation between root experiences versus epoch-making experiences. So historical experiences are where the faith originated. So things that give our faith lift. So the Red Sea or Sinai. And the Jewish responses are those that test faith. So the destruction of the first temple and the expulsion. While root experiences are normative for the formation and the continuation of the Jewish faith, epoch events test the faith. But the philosophy fails when it comes to the Holocaust, as it's a rupture in the fabric of rationality. Again, he struggles to be able to give meaning to the Holocaust in terms of philosophy, as an idea is refuted when it no longer affects events. So unless people witness ideas, they're impotent. And so for Fackenheim, God becomes impotent. Auschwitz, he says, is new, but evil is not. All previous sufferings are inadequate when compared to Auschwitz, and there is no precedent. Anything that compromises the uniqueness of the Holocaust is inauthentic for Fackenheim and robs the victims of their identity. And we have instead to return to root experiences if we're to have any hope of revitalizing the faith. He acknowledges that there are great reasons to stop believing in God, but he has more faith in the historical God than the God of the present. For Fackenheim, we are divorced from God. It's not that God stops existing, it's just that we have stopped being in relationship with God. And therefore, Fackenheim says that we cannot give Hitler a posthumous victory, and creates the 614th commandment, which is to be Jewish. To be Jewish, Jewish survival is a holy action. We have no choice but to not escape into cynicism or other worldliness. Our third thinker in this context is Greenberg, who says that the Holocaust was unique, but rather part of a covenantal scheme. The inaction of the Shoah was a call, inaction of God in the Shoah was a call for people to act. It now becomes a voluntary covenant. God cannot compel us into covenant, rather we have to compel ourselves. This voluntary covenant is God, morally speaking, must repent of the covenant. And as we go forward, Greenberg says, how can Hitler be the one who would break God's covenant? If Hitler could break it, then God could surely not be God, and Hitler himself would deserve a significant place in Jewish belief. So perhaps then one would say there could not be a covenant in the first place. The last thinker I want to give a little bit of time to in a slightly different way is because of what I said at the beginning about the lack of female voices and the lack of queer voices within this field. And into this emerges Melissa Raphael, who has taught at Leo Baeck and has produced this book, The Female Voice of God at Auschwitz. The dominant theme of post-Holocaust theology has been that of this kind of temporary hiddenness of God, and God's movement, as we saw with these previous three thinkers, of moving into a deferral into human freedom. But traditional Judaic obligations of the female presence, together with this traditional image of the Shekhinah as a figure of God's femaleness accompanying God into exile, seem to, for Melissa, contradict such theologies of absence. And this female face of the God at Auschwitz is a book which tries to give voice to that. She says God's face was not hidden at Auschwitz, but intimately revealed in the female face, turned towards the other as a reflective image of God, especially in the moral protest made visible through material and spiritual care for the assaulted other. I came across the most beautiful quote about Raphael when I was doing some reading around this from one of her students who said, Raphael does theology is something like a musician interpreting a score on the page. She attends not only to the notes, but to the silences between the notes. The silences between the notes of women's memoirs from the camps, and she helps us, her readers, to do the same. So in her book, from the very first pages, she makes it clear that she's responding to a range of influential post-Holocaust theologies written almost exclusively by men, which presume a patriarchal or androcentric framework. Like other feminist theologians, she argues that patriarchal or exclusively male images or discourses in synagogue or in church, indeed, have sanctioned a great deal of injustice, misogyny, and violence in society, and in no small part by obscuring the female face of God. God's nurturing, indwelling presence, known in the Jewish biblical and rabbinic tradition as Shekhinah. Patriarchal forces have veiled the divine feminine to the point of disappearance, and she argues that that is nowhere more horrific than in Auschwitz. And so what she tries to do is to give voice to these women, and in not asking where was God in Auschwitz, but who was God in Auschwitz. By and large, Holocaust theology has not questioned its own basic model of God. It's had, when it's developed, like we saw in the previous three theologians, a patriarchal model of God, not just in God's self, but in the way that we ask the question, who or where was God? And so maybe, Tom, can you take us to the next slide where I think we have, right. Does someone want to unmute and read this? Because I've just talked, and then maybe we can have a little think about what she's doing here in this piece. Anybody? You just have to unmute and start reading, I think, because I can't see you.
Sunday morning prayer. Dear God, these are anxious times. Tonight, for the first time, I lay in the dark with burning eyes, a scene after scene of a human suffering passed before me. I shall promise you one thing, God, just one very small thing. I shall never burden my today with cares about my tomorrow. Although that takes some practice, each day is sufficient unto itself. I shall try to help you, God, to stop my strength ebbing away, though I cannot vouch for it in advance. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear to me, that you cannot help us, that we must help you to help ourselves, and that it is all we can manage these days, and also that all that really matters, that we safeguard that little piece of you, God, us in ourselves, and perhaps in others as well. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last.
Thank you, Gail. A really quite difficult piece, I think, to read and to hear. And here in this and other passages that she highlights in her book, she's describing a framework where there's this theology of image rather than a covenantal theology alone. She's trying to express that it's through the other that that divinity is expressed, tended for in the tended person. God in Auschwitz was knowable in the moment of being seen in the face of the other. She's using a kind of, for those of you that maybe have struggled through some Emmanuel Levinas, she's locating this sense of God in the face of the human other. She's not suggesting that God cannot be known where somebody doesn't turn their face, but really it can be tended to in that sense of relationship and human partnership. She's trying to reclaim a sense of the divine, which often has been marginalized and hidden from a Western a Western theology, and open it up to us being able to hear other stories, as I said at the beginning, in this gap between the words. and in and of itself, it's a kind of subversive imagery that we do find in a lot of feminine theology. Okay, I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. Tom, if you go to the next slide. Okay, so maybe can I remove my spotlight and then I can see people? There we go. That's much better. Right. Before maybe we look at other texts, let's come off. Can I stop sharing? Stop sharing for a second, Tom. Let's see each other for a minute. Perfect. Right. I've just talked at you pretty much for half an hour. It's a lot of stuff to take in. Let's hear any comments, any immediate reactions to this, and then we'll have a look at a few texts together.
If you just unmute yourself straight away. Oh, Kathy's got one there.
Perfect. Thanks, Erin.
I just love that last that last paragraph. I just thought that was such a beautiful response, and the one that does it for me. And it was nice to find it. Yeah,
I agree, Kathy. Absolutely. And it brought together for me a kind of stage process of reading this book again. Really made a lot of sense.
Are there any male rabbis or male voices that have said the same thing?
Well, I mean, Judith can speak to this much better than I, but when she talks about, she's shaking her head. But in terms of this sense, I mean, I think Raphael is absolutely loaded in this in Levinas, and I think in Buber, in the sense of the encounter of between people, and has taken it and made it specifically combined with. She also talks about. Judith Butler as well in her writing about this kind of, she makes it specifically feminine faces of encounter. So yes, people have definitely talked about finding God in the experience with the other, but this is very specific in her writing. Any other thoughts, people?
Thank you, Charlie. Very thought-provoking, but isn't it the trauma by itself an attack on the attachment? And are not the Jews facing the trauma through improving the attachment
to the Holocaust?
Yes, yes, through the Holocaust. And if the trauma is an impeachment of the caregiver or the creator, isn't it the entity of the Jewish soul that would contain the presence of it?
Well, I mean, I don't even know where to begin. I'm picking that, Alex.
Within the community, within the connection that is through the pain.
I mean, the interesting place, I think, where that kind of theory comes across is very much in kind of Israeli identity and their reaction to the Holocaust, and particularly when you look at some of the writings around some of the early markers or memorials or statues to the Holocaust that portrayed themselves in, which was very much a detachment from anything to do with religion and relationship, which was all putting the power on the individual, a kind of a great big grown up child who's disinherited their parent, while still, as we, if we're going to apply psychological terms to it, while still living out the fact that that trauma hasn't actually been dealt with. I think if we bring that to our identity as liberal Jews, I think, as I said at the beginning, I think we are again still living that out, right? We're out of a very rationalist tradition where actually the processes of rationalist thought do not do justice to being able to grapple with the Shoah. And for our generations, post-Holocaust, it's still very much part of our present history. And so I don't think we can put it into a moment outside ourselves, because we're still internalizing it. And we're not at the point of being able to do, I take the third generation stuff, for example. What's really interesting is some of the work that's been done around inherited trauma for third generation. And I'm sure that we're going to be seeing that come out in some, or maybe we already are and are not yet conscious of it, in some of the, maybe part of the reason we've gone back to such a personalized, almost naturalistic God, is because of exactly we're trying to reinterpret the way that we see God, because we're not yet ready to face God as the parent in the face of the Holocaust. Quite possibly. And I'm not sure that answered it. It's just my thinking immediate reaction to
yes it's we are not dealing with the matter, a philosopher would say. We're dealing with the mental presentation of the matter within ourselves.
Yes, there we go. Much better said. Thank you.
And Alex, I was just, sorry, Charlie, I just wanted to say as well that when we say we have multiple identities within our liberal Jewish community.
Absolutely.
When I hear our children speaking about their Jewish identity, and especially how we teach Holocaust, how we actually and help them to experience it, whether we reinforce the notion of victimhood or we help them to identify and place Shoah within their complex Jewish identities. That's a fascinating thing, and I think it's as we balance out within our communities, there are so many different responses. And rather than invalidating any of them, it's very much, I think, holding them and listening to the variety.
Right. I mean, I think there's a lot there as well, Aaron, in what you just said as well. I think two things strike me. One, Raphael wrote this book, or put this book for her daughter. She said in the moment that she kind of realized that her daughter would be experiencing this period of time in a different way to she did it with as a child of survivors, she realized she had to write this book. And often we think of victimhood as pejorative, right? Like particularly, I think, it is victim sound, especially in today's, we talk about survivors rather than victims. But actually, I don't know if I'm going to say something very controversial. I haven't quite thought this through before I say it out loud. There has been something quite important about our protectionism that comes from thinking of ourselves within that context, that maybe there's the potential of being able to make something positive out of something where we have traditionally seen it as being a negative, because there was a sense of something happening to us, right? Rather than the survival aspect of it is, it's too triumphalistic in some ways. It loses that moment of suspending oneself to understanding God as in that context. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, and it's just so, I mean, that's the difficulty. It's just so huge. It takes us time to think about it, Charlie.
Other thoughts?
It may be a little bit off message, but
go off message, well, Tony.
No, it's still there, but I thought I'd share one thing. Some of you know that I used to work for a charity called Freedom from Torture. And while I was there, I didn't create that name. It was already in process, but the charity was working hard to change its name. And it had been founded, and many people will know, it was founded by a Jewish woman, Helen Bamber, but its original name was the Medical Foundation for the Care of Victims of Torture. Victims of torture. And then over the passage of time, and that was in the, I've got to think, I think it was the late 60s, I've forgotten maybe early 70s, I've forgotten the period, but about in the 70s. Anyway, victims of torture was the phrase. And then towards the 2000s, maybe 2010s, I mean, it was becoming very clear that there was a desire to change that language. And it's just interesting, as you were saying it there. I obviously spent a lot of time with survivors of torture, and I mean, it's pretty shocking to see sort of post-Holocaust tragedies still happening on a pretty enormous scale around the world. So that's fairly shocking. But it was interesting to see the change of language being used. And so now much more empowerment, much more talk about survivors, and the word victim is probably not even used, or I think that language is just gone.
It's really interesting, thanks. The other thing that I think about when you say, when you talk about other survivors, is to think about the inadequacy of some of the immediate, or the kind of the responses to the Holocaust being unique, right? It's unique to us in terms of a people, for sure. But in terms of a theology that only sees us as unique and in relationship with that, becomes independently problematic. And like you say, it continues. Anybody else? Anything other? So Kathy said to us that kind of sense of that last piece, the sense of the voice there, and this tending to and seeing God in the other and in the relationship, was something that spoke to her. Are there other? Can we put a theology on this? Do we still need to? Are we still, like, as liberal Jews now, is it should we still be seeing our theology in context of the Shoah, or actually are we? Yes. Oh, hey, nice to see you.
Lovely to see you. Just for everybody else, I only converted a couple of weeks ago. I've been coming.
You've been doing this for years.
Oh yeah. I had a model where religions, sects hold particular testimonies in trust for all people. In the same, and Jews being a peculiar people alike to the world. And I think that we have to hold the Holocaust up to remind other faiths this happened. Your God did this, let this happen. It's a bit Fackenheim, and I'm not expressing it very well because I've only just thought it. But I do think that there's not only do we have to come to terms to have a relationship with the Holocaust for ourselves, but we also need to have that for other people.
Well, interestingly, all as well, I mean, it was also people who did this, right? And building that relationship with people is often as hard as, or maybe harder than building the relationship. It's Gail. Hey.
Yeah, I completely concur with the previous speaker. I think we were the example. It is people that do this, and we can see it worldwide, can't we? It was called Shoah, it was the Holocaust, but it still happens today. And I think our participation in supporting that is really important, in supporting, exposure of that is really important. Tomorrow, Rabbi Baginsky is my bet din. So I am so delighted to be here tonight talking about with you, because I was first exposed to the horrors of the Holocaust as a history student at A level, and I thank Ruth Shire, who I've spotted, because she brought the meeting to my attention. But I do think it is people, and it's about outing the atrocities that we see.
Yeah, it's really, first of all, thank you for sharing that, because it's really such a proud moment as well for us to be able to welcome people into our community, and but also to kind of hear you know, that deep connection that it can have to identity. You know, A-level students quite significant, and to be
I was
carrying...
18 and I converted last year. I'm 53.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It's the way that we carry this moment with us. Paul, I can see you waving at me, I think.
Okay. I don't think this will come to any surprise to Aaron, who's my son-in-law, but I don't have any real belief in a God who is responsible for these things or not responsible for these things. I've been deeply involved in Holocaust education for many years. I'm convinced that the capabilities of human beings to do terrible things to other human beings through bigotry, hatred, scapegoating, knows no bounds. Hitler was probably the ultimate example of it with his Nazis and their collaborators right the way across Europe. It wasn't just the Nazis, but there were people in every country that they conquered who were willing to murder Jews in the most brutal ways. In the same way that the Chinese are doing with the Uyghurs at the moment, etc. I mean, we know what's going on, and I think Putin is almost a reincarnation of Hitler in his attitudes. I think the only way to deal with it is education through children, and get them as young as possible in an age-appropriate way to teach them about the terrible things that can be done through hatred, misunderstanding, through scapegoating, through bigotry, through putting on somebody who's different, whether it be skin color, language, sexual orientation, or whatever it might be, and to teach them about these things. Holocaust is a really good example of using that, and certainly in the programs that I was teaching, Holocaust is used as an example of what can happen when things get out of control, when the capability of terrible, terrible things is handed to a nation who've got nobody to stop them. They just go ahead and do it. And for me, that's really what it's about. I can't see, and I could never see, why there was no God in Auschwitz, because I don't think there was a God anywhere. No God in the way that many people perceive a God could possibly allow something like that to happen. Yeah. There was no justification, no logic, nothing. I believe it is the sheer evil amongst certain people in this country, in this world. And I believe the majority of people in this world are perfectly lovely, normal, wonderful people who want to get on with all the other wonderful people and live their lives. But there are many who want to spoil it and despoil it. Look at what's going on in America at the moment. Yeah. The hatred that's coming out of the Republican side is horrible, and some on the Democratic side. It's ghastly. You know, you can't have a civilized conversation or a disagreement about something these days. It descends into hate. And what we're talking about is a manifestation of hate in the most awful way. So education, I know Tony Blair said it, but education has got to be the answer. It's the only answer, but how we do it on a large enough scale, I really don't know.
I think I don't think any of us would disagree in terms of the importance of education. I think tonight is slightly different though, because it's about how we process our own identity with the Holocaust. So rather than the external ways that we can educate about the Holocaust, it's also about our own processes and how that's become part of both our liberal Jewish identity, but our Jewish identity. And for many of us, however many times we may wrestle with the idea of God or God's existence or non-existence, and even in the kind of most rational moments wonder how somebody else's God could be the God that they believe in. And you know, it's not just politics that people do things God's name in the name of hate, but in God's name. But I often find myself in those kind of moments, and many of you will have been in shul over Yom Kippur, and find yourself turning back to Elie Wiesel and the incredible story that Elie Wiesel that's in the Machzor. But maybe what I'll do is just, because of that, we'll end on a quote from Elie Wiesel, who said, "I've not lost faith in God. I've moments of anger and protest, and sometimes I've been closer to God for that reason. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference." Thank you all for studying with me tonight. It's really such a privilege when I get to do this. And tonight of all nights. So thank you for being with me, and thank you, Aaron, for hosting, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Charley. And it's been an incredible evening. I know we'll have provoked lots of questions that even if we, the idea within liberalism is never always to provide the answers, but very much to keep on questioning and keep on questioning ourselves, our own faith, belief, non-belief, however it is. But to be able to do so in such a beautiful way as we have done this evening as friends across our communities. Thank you so much, Charley, for presenting these ideas, and we really look forward to hearing more from you as well as a teacher, not just as a chief executive,
bureaucrat,
of our movement. No, absolutely, and it's been a privilege for us who are here tonight to do that. Next week we move on to thinking from Rabbi Judith Rosenberry, who is here, and Rabbi Mike Shah, who loads of his family were here tonight, even if he was not, and looking forward to their engagement next week. Come ready to spend time speaking with each other as well. I know that Judith has requested the opportunity for us to be able to speak with each other as well, and to tease out some of the questions that she and Mike raised together. But for now, thank you all so much, very much indeed. I'll leave you to your own thoughts on this eve of Kristallnacht, but this has been a really good way for us, it feels, and for me, to spend this evening. Thank you so much indeed.